In Chapter 8, Segment 2, Suppression, sometimes we need receptors to be quiet. It says that successful survival does not depend on exact reporting of stimuli. It is based on the changes of the stimuli. Accessory structures can reduce the level of input in the sensory pathway, for example, closing eyelids. In the auditory system, middle ear muscles contract and reduces the intensity of sounds that reach the inner ear. The relevant of mechanisms change the intensity of the stimulus before it reaches the receptors. Neural connections also descend from the brain to lower stations in the sensory pathway. Top-down process is a process in which higher-order cognitive processes control lower-order systems, often reflecting conscious control. Higher centers in the pain system send axons down the spinal cord where they inhibit incoming pain signals. Top-down processing is also evident in the auditory system, where cells in the brainstem send axons along the auditory nerve to connect with the base of the receptor cells to dampen their response to certain sounds. In Pathways, Successful Levels of the Nervous System Process Sensory Information, it says that sensory information travels from the sensory surface to the highest levels of the brain, and each sensory system has its own distinctive pathway. Receptors lead to the spinal cord or brainstem, where they can connect to distinct clusters of neurons. These cells have axons that connect to other groups of neurons. Each sensory modality, touch, vision, or hearing, has a distinct hierarchy of tracks and stations in the brain known as sensory pathways. Sensory pathways are the chain of neural connections from sensory receptor cells to the cortex. Every station in the pathway accomplishes an aspect of information processing. Example, stimulation of pain in the hand leads to reflexing of moving away your hand, which is mediated by spinal circuits. Sensory pathways terminate in the cerebral cortex, where the most complex aspects of sensory processing take place. The thalamus is the brain regions at the top of the brainstem that trade information with the cortex. Every sensory modality is sent to a separate division of the thalamus. The brain suppresses particular stimuli for the cortex to direct the thalamus to emphasize some sensory information. In receptive fields, what turns on this particular receptor cell? Receptive field is the stimulus region and features that affect the activity of a cell in a sensory system. To find the receptive field, the neuron's electrical responses are recorded to a variety of stimuli to see what makes the activity of the cell change from its resting state. Receptive fields differ in size and shape and in the quality of stimulation that activates them. If, for example, some neurons respond to light touch while others fire most rapidly in response to painful stimuli and others respond to cooler touch. The receptive fields change considerably when successive neuron combines information from prior cells in the pathway. In receptive fields in the cerebral cortex, it says that there are several different regions of cortex that receive information for each given sensory modality about that sense. Each cortical region has a separate map of the same receptive surface, but the different cortical regions process the information differently and make different contributions to perceptual experiences. In primary sensory cortex, it is for a given sensory modality the region of cortex that receives most of the information about that modality from the thalamus, or in the case of olfaction, directly from the secondary sensory neurons. It lies in the postcentral gyrus of the parietal cortex, just behind the central sulcus, dividing the parietal lobe from the frontal lobe. Secondary sensory cortex is also called non-primary sensory cortex. For a given sensory modality, the cortical regions receiving direct projections from primary sensory cortex for that modality. Secondary somatosensory cortex is also called somatosensory 2. The region of cortex that receives direct projections from primary somatosensory cortex. It maps both sides of the body in registered overlay. That is, the left arm and right arm representations occupy the same part of the map, and so forth. In attention, how do we notice some stimuli but not others? It says that attention is a state or condition of selective awareness or perceptual receptivity by which specific stimuli are selected for enhanced processing. Sometimes attention can be top-down processing when we decide to concentrate our attention on something specific. Our attention, however, can be refocused. The posterior parietal lobe plays a specific role in attention. Cingulate cortex, also called cingulum, is a region of medial cerebral cortex that lies dorsal to the corpus callosum. In sensory systems influence one another, it says that often the use of one sensory system influences perception derived from another sensory system. For example, cats may not respond to birds unless they can both see and hear the birds. Many sensory areas in the brain do not represent exclusively a single modality but show a mixture of inputs from different modalities. Loss of input from one modality allows these cells to analyze input from the remaining senses better. Polymodal is involving several sensory modalities. It provides a mechanism for intersensory interactions. A stimulus in one modality may evoke another perception. In touch, many sensations blended together. It says it is a massive array of sensory receptors monitoring many types of stimuli. Skin has different sensory experiences such as pressure, vibration, tickle, pins and needles, and more complex dimensions such as smoothness or wetness. In attention, how do we notice some stimuli but not others? It says that attention is a state or condition of selective awareness or perceptual receptivity by which specific stimuli are selected for enhanced processing. Sometimes attention can be top-down processing when we decide to concentrate our attention on something specific. Our attention, however, can be refocused. The posterior parietal lobe plays a specific role in attention. Cingulate cortex, also called cingulum, is a region of medial cerebral cortex that lies dorsal to the corpus callosum. In sensory systems influence one another, it says that often the use of one sensory system influences perception derived from another sensory system. For example, cats may not respond to birds unless they can both see and hear the birds. Many sensory areas in the brain do not represent exclusively a single modality but show a mixture of inputs from different modalities. Loss of input from one modality allows these cells to analyze input from the remaining senses better. Polymodal is involving several sensory modalities. It provides a mechanism for intersensory interactions. A stimulus in one modality may evoke another perception. In touch, many sensations blended together. It says it is a massive array of sensory receptors monitoring many types of stimuli. Skin has different sensory experiences such as pressure, vibration, tickle, pins and needles, and more complex dimensions such as smoothness or wetness. Skin is a complex organ that contains a variety of sensory receptors. It says that skin is considered to be the largest human organ. It is made up of several separate layers. The epidermis is the thinnest layer, and it is over the dermis. The dermis is the middle layer of skin between the epidermis and the hypodermis. It contains a rich web of nerve fibers and a network of connective tissue and blood vessels. The hypodermis, also called subcutaneous tissue, is the innermost layer of skin under the dermis. It provides an anchor for muscles, contains Pacinian corpuscles, and helps shape the body. Pain, heat, and cold are detected by free nerve endings in the skin. Light touch is detected by 4 highly sensitive tactile touch receptors. Tactile means of or relating to touch. Pacinian corpuscles have an onion-like outer layer which acts as a filter which shields the underlying nerve fiber from the most stimulation. Only vibrating of more than 200 Hz will pass through the corpuscle. Meissner's corpuscle is a skin receptor cell that detects light touch. It is more numerous than Merkel's disc, but offers less spatial resolution. It is specialized to respond to changes in stimuli and to detect localized movement between the skin and the surface. Merkel's disc is a skin receptor cell type that detects fine touch. It is inhibitory surrounded, which increases their spatial resolution. Both Meissner's corpuscles and Merkel's disc respond to edges on the surface and make a specialized ion channel called piezo-2. Piezo-2 is a receptor protein in touch receptors that responds to mechanical stretch by opening channels to let cations in to depolarize the cell. The final slow adapting Ruffini's endings detects the stretching of the skin when we move fingers or limbs. All 4 of these light touch receptors utilize moderately large myelinated fibers. In the dorsal column system carries somatosensory information from the skin to the brain. It says that touch receptors that we have described send their axons to the spinal cord where they enter their dorsal horn and turn upward, traveling to the brain along the spinal cord's dorsal column of white matter. The dorsal column system is a somatosensory system that delivers most touch stimuli via the dorsal columns of spinal white matter to the brain. These axons go down the dorsal column nuclei in the medulla. The dorsal column nuclei is a collection of neurons in the medulla that receives somatosensory information via the dorsal columns of the spinal cord. These neurons send their axons across the midline into the thalamus. The skin surface can be divided into bands corresponding to the spinal nerves that carry the axons from different regions. A dermatome is a strip of skin innervated by a particular spinal nerve. The pattern is hard to understand since it evolved from the 4-legged ancestors. They make more sense on a person depicted in a quadrupedal posture.